Security, remove him. He's not a guest. The sentence didn't just echo. It landed like a verdict, sharp and final, slicing through the polished quiet of the Grand Meridian Hotel lobby at exactly 10:12 a.m., where sunlight poured through 40-foot glass windows and bounced off marble floors so clean they reflected every movement like a mirror that never lied. And in the center of that reflection stood Darius Vaughn, 6'2", shoulders relaxed, dressed in dark denim jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and sneakers that looked worn not from neglect, but from intention, like someone who knew exactly how he wanted to be seen, or not seen at all. And he didn't move. Not when the receptionist folded her arms. Not when the manager stepped forward with that tight smile people wear when they think they've already won. Not even when a security guard shifted his stance just 2 feet away, ready but hesitant. Because something about Darius didn't match the story they were telling about him. And that was the problem, because stories like these depend on certainty, on quick judgments, on the quiet agreement that someone either belongs or they don't. And this morning, in this lobby, they had already decided he didn't. Sir, I'm going to need you to leave, the manager said again, louder this time, as if volume could manufacture authority, his name tag reading Evan Brooks, guest services director, his posture rigid, his tone rehearsed, like he'd said versions of this before, like this wasn't new, like this was policy dressed up as professionalism. And Darius finally blinked, slow, deliberate, the kind of blink that wasn't about confusion but about patience, the kind that said he had seen this before, many times, in many places, and still chose not to rush. I have a reservation, he said, voice low, even, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, like a fact that didn't need decoration. But Evan didn't look at the tablet Darius held out, didn't glance at the confirmation number glowing on the screen, didn't ask for clarification, because this wasn't about verification, it was about perception, and perception had already made its decision the moment Darius walked through those revolving doors alone. No luggage, no suit, no signal of status that fit the image they trusted, and behind the front desk, a young receptionist named Claire tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to show doubt without saying it out loud. Our penthouse reservations are typically pre-verified, she said, choosing her words carefully, like someone trained to sound polite while implying suspicion. And we don't have you listed, she added, even though she hadn't checked again, even though the system sat right in front of her, waiting, because checking would mean risking being wrong, and being wrong would mean confronting something deeper than a simple mistake. And across the lobby, near a row of cream-colored armchairs, a woman in her early 30s paused mid-step, her phone already halfway raised before she realized it. Something about the tension pulling her attention like gravity. Is everything okay? She asked, not loudly, but enough to break the illusion that this was normal, and Evan turned toward her with a quick, controlled smile. Just handling a situation, ma'am, he said, dismissive in tone but polite in wording, the kind of response designed to reassure some while excluding others, and Darius noticed it, the shift, the audience forming, the subtle way the room was beginning to lean, not yet in his favor, but no longer entirely against him. And he remained still, hands relaxed at his sides now, the tablet lowered, as if he had already moved past the need to prove anything. And that unsettled them more than resistance ever could, because resistance is predictable, but calm is not. Calm suggests confidence, and confidence suggests something they might have overlooked. Sir, I'm asking you one last time, Evan said, stepping closer, reducing the distance to less than 3 feet, entering what most people would consider personal space. Leave the property. And there it was again, property, ownership implied but misunderstood, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted behind Darius's eyes, not anger, not fear, something older, something quieter, like a memory rising just beneath the surface, not fully visible yet, but close, very close, and then gone, replaced by the same steady composure. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius Vaughn. The air in the lobby wasn't silent anymore. It was charged, like the moment before a storm breaks, subtle but undeniable, and near the concierge desk, a junior staff member, named Luis, shifted his weight, eyes flicking between Darius and the reservation system on his screen, because he had seen something earlier, a name that didn't quite register at the time, but now sat in his memory like a piece of a puzzle he wasn't sure he was allowed to complete, and he hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, because speaking up has a cost, especially when hierarchy is watching, especially when the person in charge has already decided the outcome, and Darius noticed him. 2. Just a glance, brief but intentional, the kind of glance that didn't demand action but made it possible, and then the moment stretched, seconds feeling longer than they should, until Evan exhaled sharply and gestured toward security. "Go ahead," he said, not looking away from Darius, as if daring him to react, as if expecting a protest, a raised voice, something he could point to and say, "See? This is why." But Darius didn't give him that. He simply stood there, grounded, as if the marble beneath his feet belonged to him in a way no one else in the room could understand. And that was the thing about power. Real power doesn't rush to announce itself. It waits, it observes, it allows others to reveal themselves first. And in that lobby, under that light, surrounded by quiet luxury and rising tension, Darius Vaughn was doing exactly that, letting the moment unfold, letting every word, every glance, every decision stack up, not as noise, but as evidence, because this wasn't just about being asked to leave. This was about something much bigger, something deeper, something that had been building long before he ever walked through those doors, and everyone in that room, whether they realized it or not, was now part of it. The security guard did not rush in, and that hesitation stretched across the lobby like a crack in glass, small but spreading, because uncertainty is contagious, and once it appears it never stays contained, and Darius noticed it immediately. The way the man's hand hovered but did not land. The way his eyes flicked not just at Darius but toward Evan, as if waiting for something more than a command, something like certainty, something like proof, and Evan felt it too, the shift, the slight erosion of control, and he responded the only way people like him know how when authority starts to slip. He doubled down. "We are not going to debate this," he said, his voice sharper now, losing that polished edge. "You are not registered here, and you are disrupting our guests." And the words sounded official, structured, rehearsed, but they carried something underneath them, something that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with perception. And Claire nodded beside him, reinforcing it without thinking, because alignment feels safer than doubt, especially when you are part of a system that rewards agreement. And across the room the woman with the phone took a few slow steps closer, her camera no longer halfway raised but fully active now, her screen reflecting the scene back at her in real time, and she whispered, almost to herself, "This does not feel right." And that whisper traveled farther than it should have, because once a moment is named it becomes harder to ignore. And Darius shifted his weight slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just grounding himself, like someone who understood that movement right now would not serve him. And he let the silence stretch just a second longer before speaking again. "Run the name," he said, his tone unchanged, steady, almost quiet, but direct enough that it cut through the noise without needing volume. And for a brief second Claire hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, because this was the moment where assumption meets verification, and verification can undo everything. And Evan saw it, the hesitation, and stepped in before it could become action. "We already checked," he said quickly, too quickly. "There is nothing under that name." And it was not entirely true, not entirely false. It was something in between, the kind of statement that relies on speed more than accuracy. And Luis felt his chest tighten as he watched it unfold, because he had seen the name earlier, Vaughn, flagged differently, tagged with something he had never seen before, something that required higher clearance, something he was not supposed to access without instruction. And now that name was standing 10 feet away, being told it did not exist, and the disconnect pressed against him like pressure building in a sealed room. And still he said nothing, not yet, because timing matters, and fear has a way of delaying even the right decision. And Darius caught the flicker of recognition in Luis's eyes, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough, not to act, but to confirm, to anchor what he already knew. And then another voice entered the moment, older, slower, carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than they let on. "Why will you not just check again?" a man near the entrance said, his tone calm but firm, not confrontational but unwilling to stay silent. And Evan turned toward him, irritation flashing across his face before it was quickly masked. "Sir, we are handling it," he replied. But the room had already shifted another inch, because now it was not just observation, it was participation, and participation changes everything. And the security guard lowered his hand slightly, not stepping back fully, but no longer moving forward either, caught between instruction and instinct. And Darius remained exactly where he was, his presence now heavier, not because he had raised his voice, but because he had not, because calm in the face of pressure forces everyone else to confront their own behavior, and that is far more uncomfortable than any argument. And then Claire spoke again, but softer this time, less certain. "Maybe we should just verify one more time," she said, her eyes flicking between Evan and the screen, and Evan's jaw tightened, just enough to reveal that this was no longer going according to his script, because scripts rely on compliance, and compliance was beginning to crack. And he leaned in closer to the desk, lowering his voice but sharpening it. "We are not doing this again," he said, each word controlled but edged. And in that moment it became clear, not just to Darius, but to everyone watching, that this was not about process anymore. It was about control, and control once challenged often reveals its true nature. And the woman filming took another step closer, her voice now steady. "You have a system right there," she said. "Why not just use it?" And the question hung in the air, simple, reasonable, impossible to dismiss without exposing something deeper. And Luis exhaled slowly, the pressure inside him reaching a point where silence felt heavier than risk, and he finally moved, just a small step forward, his voice careful but clear. "I saw the reservation earlier," he said, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to shift the axis of the room, enough to make I turned, enough to make Evan freeze for just a fraction of a second. And that fraction was all it took for the narrative to begin unraveling. Because once doubt enters, it does not leave quietly. And Darius turned his head slightly toward Luis, not with surprise, not with urgency, but with acknowledgement, a silent recognition that said you chose your moment. And the room felt different now, not resolved, not calm, but changed, like something invisible had just tipped, and no one in that lobby could quite return to where they had been 30 seconds before. The moment Luis spoke, the air in the lobby shifted in a way no one could ignore, not loud, not explosive, but precise, like a single thread pulled from a tightly woven fabric that suddenly made everything else feel unstable. And Evan's expression changed, just slightly, the confidence in his posture tightening into something more rigid, more defensive, because control depends on consistency. And Luis had just introduced contradiction. "You saw what?" Evan asked, his tone low but sharpened, not asking for clarity but demanding alignment. And Luis swallowed, his throat dry but his stance no longer retreating. "I saw the reservation earlier this morning," he repeated, this time a little clearer, the words landing with more weight now that they had been said once and survived. And Claire looked at him quickly, her eyes widening for a split second before she turned back to the screen, fingers hovering again, no longer still, no longer neutral. Because now there was a possibility that she had ignored something. And ignoring something is different from not knowing. Ignoring carries responsibility, and responsibility is uncomfortable, especially in a room full of witnesses. And the woman filming took another step forward, her voice now steady. "So you did not check," she said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement placed carefully into the space between them. And Evan exhaled sharply, the sound controlled but edged. "We followed protocol," he replied, but the words felt thinner now, less solid, because protocol, without transparency, starts to sound like an excuse. And Darius watched all of it without interruption, his gaze moving slowly from one person to another, not judging, not reacting, just observing, like someone taking note of every detail, every hesitation, every shift in tone, because moments like this are not about speed. They are about clarity. And clarity takes time, and he had plenty of it. And then he spoke again, calm as before. "Run the name," he said, the same words, the same tone, but now they carried something different, not a request, not even a suggestion, something closer to inevitability, and Claire hesitated only a fraction of a second before her fingers finally touched the keyboard. The soft clicking sound cutting through the tension like a quiet countdown, and Evan stepped closer again, his presence now less commanding and more urgent. "Claire," he said, a warning wrapped in a name. But it was too late, because once action begins it cannot be undone, and the system responded the way systems always do, without bias, without hesitation, just data, and for a brief moment nothing appeared, just a blank field, and Evan's shoulders lifted slightly, as if relief had arrived too early, and then the screen refreshed, and everything changed. Because the name did not just appear, it expanded, multiple layers. Access levels, internal tags that Claire had never seen before, codes that did not belong to standard reservations, and her eyes widened, her breath catching just enough to be noticed. "What is it?" Evan asked quickly, stepping closer, trying to regain ground. But Claire did not answer right away, because what she was seeing did not match anything she had been trained for. And Luis leaned slightly forward, not touching the desk, just looking, his suspicion turning into certainty in real time. And the woman filming adjusted her phone, capturing the screen from an angle, her voice barely above a whisper. "There it is." And the words spread through the room like a ripple, subtle but undeniable, and Darius did not move, did not lean in, did not look at the screen, because he did not need to. He already knew what it would show. And that is the difference between someone searching for proof and someone who is the proof. And Evan's voice cut through again, sharper now, less controlled. "Read it," he said, and Claire swallowed, her voice quieter than before. "Darius Vaughn," she said, and then paused, because the rest did not feel like something she was supposed to say out loud. Not in front of guests, not in front of him, but silence would only make it worse now. And she continued, "Executive level clearance, owner access," and the words landed heavier than anything that had been said so far. Because they did not accuse, they did not argue, they confirmed, and confirmation ends debates faster than any raised voice ever could. And for a moment no one spoke, not Evan, not Claire, not Luis, not even the guests, because the room needed a second to recalibrate, to process the distance between what they had assumed and what was now undeniable. And Darius finally shifted, just one step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to close the gap between himself and the desk. And when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still even, but now it carried something unmistakable, authority without effort. "You said I did not belong here," he said, not looking at anyone in particular, but somehow addressing all of them at once. And the words hung there, not as a challenge, but as a mirror, reflecting back everything that had just happened. And Evan's mouth opened slightly, as if searching for something to say, something to recover the moment. But there are moments that cannot be recovered, only revealed, and this was one of them. And the lobby, once filled with quiet luxury, now held something else entirely, something heavier, something real, something that no amount of polished training could smooth over, because the truth had entered the room, and it was not leaving. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the room itself had realized something it could not take back. And Evan stood there, just 3 feet away from the man he had tried to remove, his posture still upright, but no longer grounded, because certainty had left him, and without certainty authority becomes performance, and performance cracks under pressure. "That does not change the situation," Evan said finally, but the words came slower now, less fluid, as if he had to build them piece by piece instead of pulling them from memory. And Claire turned toward him, her voice quieter than before but no longer aligned. "It changes everything," she said, and that was the moment the structure broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because once someone inside the system says it out loud, the system cannot pretend it is intact. And Darius watched her for a brief second, not with approval, not with surprise, just acknowledgement, the kind that does not need words. And then he shifted his gaze back to Evan. "You had the system," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational, but every word precise. "You had the name, and you chose not to see it." And the sentence landed harder than anything raised in volume could have, because it did not accuse, it defined, and definitions are difficult to escape. And Evan inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening again. But this time it was not control. It was containment, like he was trying to hold something from spilling out. "We were ensuring guest safety," he replied. But even he could hear it, the weakness in the phrasing, the way it did not quite connect to what had actually happened. And across the lobby the man who had spoken earlier shook his head slowly, not in anger, but in recognition. "No," he said quietly. "You were deciding who looked like a guest." And the distinction settled into the room like dust that had finally been disturbed. Visible now, undeniable, and the woman filming stepped closer again, her voice steady. "Say it again," she said, not to Darius, but to Evan. "Why did you not check?" And Evan looked at her, then at the phone, then back at Darius. And for a moment it was clear he was calculating, not facts, but outcomes, because the presence of witnesses changes the weight of every word. And Darius did not interrupt, did not rush him, because this was the part where people reveal themselves, not through pressure, but through choice. And the security guard stepped back half a step. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt, because instinct had finally caught up with instruction, and Louis stood still now, no longer uncertain, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet clarity that comes from seeing something confirmed. And Claire's hands remained on the keyboard, but she was no longer typing. She was reading, scrolling through layers she had never been trained to access, her eyes moving quickly, her understanding catching up in real time. And then she said it, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "There are internal notes here," she said, her voice steadying as she continued. "Previous complaints, flagged incidents, unresolved." And the words did something different this time. They did not just expose the present moment. They connected it to something larger, something older, something that had been there before Darius ever walked in. And Darius's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in recognition, because this was no longer about a single interaction. It was about a pattern, and patterns do not hide well once they are named. And Evan's head turned quickly toward the screen. "That is internal," he said, his tone sharper again, but now it sounded defensive, not authoritative, and Claire did not stop. 8 complaints in the last 6 months. She continued, each word steady, all marked resolved. But there are no follow-ups, and the lobby shifted again, not just in tension, but in understanding, because now the story was changing shape, from a moment to a pattern, from an incident to a system, and the woman filming lowered her phone slightly, just enough to look over it, her expression no longer just curious, but focused. "So this has happened before," she said. And no one answered, because the answer was already on the screen, and Darius took one more step forward, closing the distance completely now, standing directly at the desk, not imposing, not aggressive, just present. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, still measured, but now it carried something unmistakable, finality. "You were not protecting the hotel," he said, his eyes steady on Evan. "You were protecting a habit." And the sentence landed with a weight that did not need repetition, because everyone in the room could feel it. And Evan looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not at the clothes, not at the surface, but at the man standing in front of him. And in that moment something shifted in his expression, not fully understanding, not yet accountability, but the beginning of it, the moment where denial becomes harder than truth. And the lobby, once polished and predictable, now held something else entirely. Something raw, something exposed, something that could not be smoothed over or redirected, because the narrative had already turned, and there was no going back to where it started. The words did not fade when Darius finished speaking. They settled, heavy and unmoving, like something permanent had just been placed in the center of the room, and no one could step around it without acknowledging it. And for a moment Evan said nothing, his silence louder than anything he had said before. Because it was no longer the silence of control, it was the silence of recalculation, of someone realizing the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. And Claire slowly leaned back from the screen, her fingers no longer touching the keyboard, her role no longer passive. Because once you see something clearly you cannot return to pretending you did not. And Luis remained still but attentive, his earlier hesitation replaced with a quiet steadiness, like someone who had crossed an invisible line and was no longer standing on both sides of it. And the woman filming shifted her phone slightly, capturing the expressions now instead of just the actions, because expressions tell the truth that words often avoid, and Darius stood exactly where he had been. But something about his presence had changed, not in posture, not in tone, but in weight. Like the room had finally adjusted to who he was instead of who they assumed he might be, and Evan finally spoke again. But this time his voice was different, not louder, not softer, just less certain. If there were prior issues, they were handled internally, he said. But the statement felt incomplete even as it left his mouth, because the screen behind Claire had already said otherwise, and Darius did not interrupt him, did not correct him immediately, because timing matters. And truth has a way of revealing itself more clearly when it is allowed to contrast with what is said to avoid it. And then Darius tilted his head slightly, just enough to signal attention, and spoke, handled or hidden. And the question did not need emphasis, it did not need repetition, it landed exactly where it needed to, because it was not about the past alone, it was about the present moment standing right in front of them. And Evan looked at him, really looked this time, and there was no immediate response. Because some questions do not allow for quick answers, and the man near the entrance took a slow step closer, his voice calm but firm. If it was handled, why is it still happening? And that question did something else. It expanded the moment again, pulling it beyond the two men standing at the desk and into the room itself, into the witnesses, into the shared understanding that was forming piece by piece. And Claire glanced back at the screen, her voice quieter but clearer now. There are notes here marked resolved within minutes, she said. No investigation logs, no follow-up, just closed. And the words did not accuse, they described. And sometimes description is more powerful than accusation, because it leaves less room for denial. And Luis nodded slightly, almost to himself, as if confirming what he had already begun to understand. And the security guard shifted again, this time stepping fully back, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because his role in this moment had changed without anyone formally telling him. And Darius remained calm, his gaze steady, his breathing even, and for a brief second something passed through his eyes again, not visible to everyone, but present, like a memory brushing the surface, something older than this lobby, older than this hotel, something that had happened long before Evan Brooks ever stood behind that desk with a name tag and a script, and it did not linger, it did not take over. It simply existed for a moment and then settled, and when Darius spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet weight. This is not about one mistake, he said. It is about a pattern that no one stopped. And the statement did not escalate the tension, it clarified it. And clarity is what transforms confusion into accountability. And Evan exhaled slowly. His shoulders no longer squared the same way, the performance of certainty no longer sustainable, and he glanced briefly at Claire, then at Luis, then at the guests, as if trying to find alignment somewhere. But alignment had shifted, and it was not coming back to him. And the woman filming lowered her phone slightly, just enough to look directly at him. You had a chance to check, she said, her tone not aggressive, just direct. You chose not to. And the simplicity of it made it harder to argue against, because complexity can hide. But simplicity exposes, and Evan opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. Again, the response forming and dissolving at the same time, because the room was no longer giving him space to redirect, and Darius took one small step to the side, not away from the desk, but enough to shift the angle of the moment, enough to include everyone in the space rather than keep it contained between two people, and he looked around the lobby, not scanning, not searching, just acknowledging. And when he spoke, it was not just to Evan anymore, it was to the room. Every person who walks through these doors expects one thing, he said, to be treated like they belong before they have to prove anything. And the words resonated in a way that did not require explanation, because everyone there understood it, whether they had experienced the opposite or not. And Claire looked down briefly, then back up, her expression no longer uncertain, and Luis stood a little straighter, the tension in his shoulders easing into something more resolved. And the man near the entrance nodded once, slow and deliberate. And even the security guard remained still, no longer waiting for instruction, because instruction was no longer the guiding force in the room. And Evan stood in the center of it all, no longer directing, no longer defining, just present in the reality that had unfolded around him. And for the first time since the moment began, he did not speak immediately, and that pause, that unfilled space, said more than anything he could have added, because it marked the point where the narrative had fully shifted, where authority had been replaced by accountability, and where the story was no longer about whether Darius Vaughn belonged in that hotel, but about how many times others had been told they did not, and what that meant for everyone who had stood behind that desk and decided who fit and who did not. And the lobby held that realization like a mirror no one could look away from. The lobby did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something deeper than a single interaction had been exposed, and once exposed it does not quietly disappear. It lingers, it reshapes the space, and Darius stood there not as someone demanding attention, but as someone who had already taken control of it without raising his voice, without forcing anything. And that was what made it different, what made it undeniable, and Evan shifted again, his hands now loosely at his sides. Instead of folded with confidence, his posture no longer commanding but searching, like someone trying to locate a version of himself that still fit the moment. But that version was gone, replaced by something less certain, less protected, and he cleared his throat slightly, a small sound that carried more weight than expected. If there have been inconsistencies, he began, choosing each word carefully now. They can be reviewed and corrected, and the phrasing felt distant, corporate, like something pulled from training rather than truth, and Darius listened without interrupting, because this part mattered, not for him, but for what it revealed about how systems respond when they are challenged, and he let Evan finish, let the words settle, and then he responded, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. Reviewed later does not fix what happens now, he said, and the sentence landed with precision, because it cut through the delay, the deflection, the idea that accountability could be postponed into something less visible. And Claire looked at Darius, really looked this time, her expression no longer defensive or uncertain but aware, like someone who had just realized she was part of something bigger than her role, and she glanced back at the screen again. Scrolling further, her voice steady but lower. There are patterns in the flags, she said, not to Evan, not even directly to Darius, but to the room. Names marked for extra verification without documented cause. And that detail shifted the tension again, because now it was not just about missteps. It was about intentional ones, and Louis stepped closer to the desk, not crossing any line, just closing the distance enough to be part of the moment instead of watching it. And he spoke quietly, but with certainty. I was told to watch for those tags, he said, to slow things down when they appeared. And the admission did not sound like guilt. It sounded like truth finally spoken out loud. And the woman filming inhaled slightly, her voice almost a whisper now. So it was not random, she said, and no one corrected her, because there was nothing left to correct, and Darius remained composed, his expression steady. But his presence now carried something deeper, something rooted not just in authority but in understanding, because this was not new to him. This was familiar, and for a brief second the lobby seemed to fade behind his eyes, replaced by something older, something quieter, a memory of a smaller place, a different lobby, years ago, where the lighting was harsher and the expectations lower, but the tone had been the same, the look, the pause, the unspoken assumption, and he had stood there then too, younger, less established, holding a reservation confirmation that no one wanted to acknowledge, and he remembered the feeling not as anger, but as clarity, the moment when he understood that belonging was not always given, it was often withheld, and sometimes it was taken, and that memory did not stay long. It did not need to. It had already done its work, shaping the way he stood now, the way he spoke, the way he chose not to react when reaction would have been easier, and when his focus returned fully to the present, his voice carried that same quiet certainty. This was built into the system, he said, and it was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement that connected the pieces together, and Evan exhaled again, longer this time, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if the effort of holding everything in place had finally become too much, and he looked at the screen, then at Claire, then at Luis, and finally back at Darius, and there was a shift there, subtle but real. Not yet acceptance, but no longer denial, and he spoke again, but this time without the earlier edge. That was not the intention, he said, and the words sounded different now, less like a defense and more like a realization that intention does not erase impact, and Darius nodded once, small and measured, acknowledging the statement without validating it. And then he looked around the lobby again, at the guests who had stepped closer, at the phones that were no longer just recording but witnessing, at the staff who were no longer aligned in silence but divided by truth. And he spoke again, his voice steady, clear, and directed not at one person but at everyone present. Intention does not decide who gets treated with respect, he said. Action does. And the sentence settled into the space like a final piece of something that had been forming since the moment began. And Claire lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her expression firm now, no longer uncertain, and Louise stood still beside her, his earlier tension replaced by something quieter, something resolved, and the security guard remained at a distance, no longer waiting, no longer involved, because the situation had moved beyond him, and Evan stood there in the center of it all, no longer the one directing the outcome, no longer the one defining the narrative, just part of it now, part of something that had grown beyond his control. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had already been said could not be undone, and the lobby held that silence not as emptiness, but as recognition, the kind that comes when a truth has finally been seen clearly, and there is no version of the story left that can hide it. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like pressure releasing from a room that had been sealed too long, and Darius stood at the center of it without moving, without pushing, because he understood something most people in that lobby were only beginning to realize, that once truth surfaces it does not need force to carry it forward, it moves on its own, and Evan felt it. The shift not just in the room, but in himself, the way every word he had used before now echoed. Differently, thinner, exposed, and he looked again at the screen, then at Claire, then at Louise, and finally back at Darius. But this time there was no immediate response, because the space between what he believed and what had just been revealed had grown too wide to cross with a simple sentence. And Claire spoke again, not hesitant now, not quiet in uncertainty, but steady, grounded. There are escalation protocols attached to this access level, she said, her eyes still scanning the system. Executive override, internal audit triggers, compliance review. And each word landed like a step deeper into something none of them had planned to confront. And Louise nodded slightly beside her, adding softly, "Those are not standard guest features." And the implication settled into the room, not loudly, but completely, because it confirmed what everyone already felt but had not yet fully processed, that this situation had moved far beyond a misunderstanding, far beyond a single moment at a front desk. And the woman filming lowered her phone for a second, just enough to look directly at Darius, her voice quieter now, more focused. "You knew," she said, not as an accusation but as recognition, and Darius met her gaze briefly, his expression unchanged, and then he answered, calm as before, "I have seen this before," and the words carried more weight than explanation ever could, because they did not describe just this moment, they connected it to others, to a pattern that extended beyond this building, beyond this city, and the man near the entrance exhaled slowly, his voice low but clear. "Then this is not the first time." And Darius did not answer immediately, because some confirmations do not need to be spoken. They exist in the way a room feels when everyone already knows the truth, and instead he shifted his attention back to the desk, to the system, to the structure that had allowed this moment to happen, and he spoke again. "Open the compliance panel." And the instruction was not loud, not forceful, but it carried authority that did not need to announce itself, and Claire hesitated only a fraction of a second before following it, her fingers moving across the keyboard with more confidence now, not because she fully understood what she was opening, but because she understood who was asking, and the screen changed again, deeper layers appearing, logs, timestamps, records that had not been part of her daily responsibilities, and her eyes widened slightly as she scrolled. "There are internal flags tied to employee actions," she said, her voice steady but edged with something new, something like realization, manual overrides, repeated verification delays, selective escalation, and the words landed differently this time, because they did not just describe what had happened to Darius, they described how it had been allowed to happen repeatedly, and Luis leaned in slightly, his voice firmer now. "Those require approval," he said, They do not just happen on their own. And the implication was clear. Systems do not create patterns without direction, and Darius listened, not interrupting, not correcting, because this part mattered. This part needed to come from them, from inside the system itself. And Evan finally spoke again. But the tone had changed completely, no longer controlled, no longer performative, just real. Those approvals come from management, he said, and the admission did not sound like defense. It sounded like something breaking loose, something that had been held in place now shifting into the open, and the room reacted not with noise but with understanding, because now the structure was visible, not just the actions but the decisions behind them. And the woman filming raised her phone again, her voice steady. So this was not a mistake, she said, and Evan did not respond immediately, because the answer was no longer something he could shape. It was something already present in the room, in the system, on the screen, and Darius stepped slightly closer to the desk again, not to confront, not to dominate, but to stand fully within the space that had been denied to him minutes earlier. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority, but now it held something else as well, something final. Mistakes happen. Once, he said, patterns happen by design. And the sentence settled into the lobby like a line drawn that could not be erased. And Claire stopped typing, her hands resting still now, her role no longer uncertain, and Louise stood beside her, no longer watching but present, part of the moment, and the security guard remained at the edge of the scene, no longer relevant to the direction things were moving. And Evan stood across from Darius, no longer the one directing the situation, no longer the one defining the terms, just a part of something that had grown larger than his position, larger than his authority. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had already been revealed could not be undone, and the lobby, once controlled by quiet assumptions and unspoken rules, now held something entirely different, something clear, something undeniable, something that was not going to fade when the moment ended, because this was no longer just about one man being told he did not belong. It was about a system that had decided who did, and that system was now standing in the light. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like everything inside it had been pulled into a single point of understanding that no one could step away from. And Darius stood there with the same quiet control, but now that control was no longer invisible. It had shape, it had weight, it had authority that no one could deny or reinterpret. And Claire's screen continued to glow with layers of information that should have never been hidden behind silence, her eyes scanning deeper, slower now, not out of hesitation, but because each line carried consequence. There are timestamps tied to every flagged guest, she said, her voice steady but deliberate. And multiple entries are linked to the same staff approvals, and she did not need to say more than that, because the implication was already clear. Patterns do not repeat without permission, and Louis stepped closer again, his voice firmer now, no longer uncertain. Those approvals require direct authorization, he said, looking at Evan, not accusing, not aggressive, just stating something that could not be undone, and Evan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to reshape, nothing left to redirect. The system itself had spoken, and systems do not lie. They record, they remember, they reveal, and the woman filming adjusted her phone again, capturing not just the conversation but the expressions, the silence, the shift in posture that told the real story, and she spoke softly, almost to herself. This is bigger than one moment. And that sentence carried across the room in a way no raised voice ever could, because everyone already felt it, and Darius let the silence hold for a second longer. Before he moved, just one step, placing himself fully in front of the desk, not as someone asking for access, but as someone reclaiming it. And when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still measured, but now it carried something unmistakable, final clarity. Pull the escalation chain, he said, and the instruction did not sound like a request. It sounded like something that had already begun. And Claire did not hesitate this time, her fingers moving with purpose, opening another layer of the system, one that displayed not just guest records but internal communications, approval logs, decision trails that connected actions to names, and her breath caught slightly as she read. There are internal messages tied to these flags, she said. Instructions to delay, to verify beyond standard procedure, to to question validity, and the words landed like pieces of a puzzle finally locking into place. And Luis leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. "That is not protocol," he said, and the distinction mattered, because it separated policy from behavior, structure from choice, and Darius nodded once, small and deliberate, acknowledging what had already become undeniable, and then he spoke again, his gaze steady on Evan. "You called it protocol," he said, "but this was practice." And the sentence cut through any remaining space for confusion, because practice implies repetition, intention, consistency, and Evan's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, not fully, but in recognition that the narrative he had been holding onto no longer existed. And he looked at the screen again, then at Claire, then at Luis, and finally back at Darius. And for the first time since the moment began, his voice did not try to control the outcome. It simply responded. "Those decisions were made to maintain standards," he said. But even as he spoke, the words sounded disconnected from what was now visible to everyone. Because standards that require selective enforcement are not standards, they are filters, and filters reveal more about the system than the people passing through it. And the man near the entrance stepped closer again, his voice calm but firm. "Standards should apply the same way to everyone," he said, and no one disagreed, because there was nothing left to argue against. And the woman filming lowered her phone slightly, her eyes focused on Darius now. "So what happens next?" she asked. And it was not just a question, it was an expectation, because the moment had reached a point where observation was no longer enough. Something had to change, something had to move, and Darius remained still for a second, his gaze moving across the room, taking in every face, every witness, every person who had been part of this moment, whether they intended to be or not. And for a brief second that earlier memory brushed against him again, that younger version of himself standing in a different lobby, holding proof that no one wanted to see, and the feeling that came with it. Not anger, not humiliation, but clarity. The realization that systems do not correct themselves unless someone forces them to look at what they have done. And that clarity had followed him here, into this moment, into this room. And when he spoke again, his voice carried all of it. Not loudly, not forcefully, just undeniably. "Now it gets corrected," he said, and the words did not sound like a promise. They sounded like a decision already in motion. And Claire looked at him, her expression steady, no longer uncertain, and Luis stood beside her, no longer hesitant. And even the security guard remained still at the edge of the room, no longer waiting for instruction, because the direction of this moment was no longer controlled by position or title, it was controlled by truth. And Evan stood there in front of Darius, no longer the one defining what belonged and what did not, just a part of something that had been exposed beyond repair. And the lobby, once quiet with assumption, now held something entirely different, something clear, something undeniable, something that was not going to fade when the moment ended. Because this was not just about being told to leave. This was about a system that had decided who could stay, and that system had just been brought into the light. The moment Darius said it, the words did not hang in the air, they moved, like something invisible had been set into motion behind the walls, beneath the systems, through channels no one in the lobby could see, but all of them could feel. And Claire's screen responded first, not dramatically, not with alarms or flashing lights, but with subtle changes that only someone paying attention would notice. Access levels shifting, certain fields locking, others opening, and her eyes narrowed slightly as she followed it. "There is a live audit trigger," she said, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "It just activated." And Luis leaned in, his gaze fixed on the screen, recognizing what that meant even if he had never seen it happen in real time. "That is executive level," he said quietly, and the words carried across the desk like confirmation of something no one could undo. And Evan's head turned sharply, his attention snapping fully to the screen now, because this was no longer about interpretation. This was system response, and systems do not respond to assumptions, they respond to authority. And Darius did not move, did not look at the screen, because he did not need to. He already knew what had been set in motion. And the woman filming took another step closer, her voice barely above a whisper now. "What does that do?" And Claire answered without looking away from the display. "It logs everything from this point forward," she said. "Every action, every input, every decision." And the weight of that settled instantly, because now this was not just a moment being witnessed, it was a moment being recorded at a level that could not be erased. And the man near the entrance exhaled slowly, his voice low but clear. So there is no going back. And no one answered, because the answer was already visible in the way the room felt, in the way the staff stood, in the way Evan no longer filled the space the same way he had minutes ago. And Darius finally shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to signal that the next part was not about discovery anymore. It was about action. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm authority, but now it held something sharper, something defined. Pull the staff authorization logs, he said. And Claire did not hesitate, her fingers moving quickly, confidently now, as if the hesitation that had existed earlier had been replaced entirely by clarity. And the screen changed again, lines of data appearing, timestamps, user IDs, approval chains that connected decisions to individuals, and her voice remained steady as she read. Multiple overrides tied to the same account, she said, and then paused, her eyes scanning further. Repeated entries, same authorization code. And Luis leaned in closer, his voice firmer now, no longer uncertain. That code belongs to management, he said, and the room absorbed that without resistance, because it aligned with everything that had already been revealed. And Evan's shoulders stiffened slightly, his gaze fixed on the screen, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, might try to reshape what was now clearly defined. But the words did not come, because there are moments when explanation becomes impossible, when the structure of what has been exposed does not leave room for interpretation. And the woman filming raised her phone again, her voice steady. Say it, she said, not to Darius, but to the room itself. Who approved it? And Claire hesitated just a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of the weight of what she was about to confirm. And then she spoke, clear and direct. Evan Brooks, she said. And the name did not echo. It settled, final and unmoving. Because it did not need repetition, it did not need emphasis. It was enough. And Evan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in denial, not fully, but in recognition, because the system had said it. Not a person, not a witness, not an assumption, but the record itself. And records do not bend to perception. And Darius watched him for a second, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something else, something closer to clarity, because this was not personal, it was structural. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, unchanged. You enforced it, he said, and the sentence did not accuse, it defined. And definitions are difficult to escape once they are spoken out loud. And Evan opened his eyes, his gaze no longer searching, no longer calculating, just present in the reality of the moment. And he did not respond immediately, because response requires position, and his position had shifted, and the man near the entrance stepped closer again. His voice steady. You decided who got questioned and who did not, he said, and the simplicity of it made it undeniable. And Luis remained still beside Claire, his earlier uncertainty completely gone now, replaced by a quiet understanding that what he had seen before was not isolated, not accidental. And Claire's hands rested lightly on the desk, her role no longer passive, her presence no longer neutral. And the security guard stood at the edge of the scene, no longer part of the decision making, just a witness to something larger than his role. And Darius took one final step forward, placing both hands lightly on the edge of the desk, not gripping, not imposing, just present. And when he spoke, his voice carried a final clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. This ends now, he said, and the words did not sound like a threat, they sounded like a conclusion, like something that had already been decided long before anyone in that lobby realized it. And the room held that moment, not in chaos, not in noise, but in recognition, because everyone there understood that what had just been uncovered was not just a mistake, not just a moment, but a system that had been allowed to operate in silence. And that silence had just been broken in a way that could not be undone. The words did not need to echo to be understood. They settled into the room with a finality that made movement feel almost inappropriate, like anything done too quickly would break something that had just been revealed too clearly to ignore. And Darius did not step back after saying it. He remained exactly where he was, hands resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his posture unchanged. But the space around him had shifted entirely, because what he had just declared was not a reaction. It was a conclusion. And Evan stood across from him with that same stillness. But his stillness was different. It was not controlled. It was contained, like someone holding on to something that no longer held shape. And Claire's screen continued to update quietly, line by line, documenting everything as it happened, and she watched it with a focus that no longer wavered, because now she understood that what she was seeing was not just information. It was accountability being written in real time, and Louis stood beside her, his gaze fixed, his earlier uncertainty gone completely, replaced by something steadier, something rooted in clarity, and the woman filming did not move, her phone steady, her attention locked on the moment, because she understood instinctively that this was the point where everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, and Darius finally shifted his gaze back to Evan, not aggressively, not demanding, just directly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm tone, but now it held something else, something unmistakable, authority that did not need to be introduced. "You are done making decisions here," he said, and the sentence did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact that had already taken effect, and Evan inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that showed the effort it took to process what was happening. Because this was not just about being challenged. This was about being replaced in real time, and he looked at Darius, his voice lower now, no longer projecting, no longer shaping, just asking, "Who are you?" And the question did not come from doubt anymore. It came from realization, from the need to align what he was seeing with something he could understand, and Darius did not rush the answer, because answers like that are not given, they are revealed, and he let the silence sit for just a moment longer before responding. His voice steady, clear, and final. "The one who built the system you tried to control," he said, and the words did not just identify him. They redefined the entire moment, because they placed him not outside the structure, but above it, and Claire's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition, because the access levels, the audit triggers, the authority she had seen on the screen all aligned with what he had just said, and Louise exhaled slowly. A quiet breath that carried understanding, and the man near the entrance nodded once, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect, and the woman filming whispered, almost under her breath, "He owns it." And the words spread through the room without needing to be repeated, because everyone could feel it, the shift from uncertainty to clarity, from assumption to truth, and Evan's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough, the tension in his jaw easing into something closer to realization, and he stepped back half a step, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the space he had occupied no longer belonged to him, and Darius remained still, his presence now fully established, not through volume, not through force, but through the undeniable alignment between who he was and what the system had already confirmed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but now it held direction. "Claire, revoke all active overrides tied to that authorization code," he said, and Claire nodded immediately, her fingers moving across the keyboard with precision, no hesitation, no uncertainty, because now she understood her role in this moment, and the screen responded again, confirmations appearing one by one, access revoked, permissions terminated, and Luis watched closely, his voice low but clear. "Overrides removed," he said, and the words carried weight, because they marked the beginning of change, not just acknowledgement, and Darius turned his attention back to Evan, his gaze steady. "You did not just enforce a system," he said, "you shaped it." And the statement did not accuse, it defined, and definitions have a way of closing doors that explanations try to keep open, and Evan nodded slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that something had shifted inside him, something that could no longer deny what had been made visible. And the woman filming adjusted her phone again, capturing the moment from a slightly different angle, her voice steady. "This is happening live," she said, and the phrase carried through the room like confirmation that what they were witnessing was not private, not hidden, not something that could be rewritten later, and Darius looked around the lobby once more, taking in every face, every witness, every person who had become part of this moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried not just authority, but purpose. "This place will Reflect what it was meant to be, he said, not what it became. And the sentence settled into the space like a foundation being reset. And Claire paused briefly before continuing her work, her expression focused, and Louise stood beside her, steady and present. And even the security guard remained still, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, because the direction of the moment was no longer controlled by assumption. It was controlled by truth, and Evan stood there, no longer at the center, no longer defining the narrative, just part of something that had been exposed and was now being corrected in real time. And the lobby, once shaped by quiet judgments and unspoken rules, now held something entirely different, something clear, something grounded, something that could not be undone, because what had just been revealed was not just who Darius Vaughn was, but what the system had allowed itself to become. And that truth was now impossible to ignore. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete, and the lobby that had once been guided by quiet assumptions now moved under something far more deliberate, something structured, something that could not be ignored or redirected. And Darius remained at the center of it without raising his voice, without needing to assert anything further, because the authority he carried had already been confirmed in every way that mattered. And Claire continued working through the system, her movements precise, her focus unwavering, as each command executed reflected a change that extended beyond the screen and into the structure of the place itself. And Luis stood beside her, no longer observing but actively engaged, his posture aligned with the direction the moment had taken, and Evan remained still, no longer attempting to regain control, because control was no longer his to reclaim. And that realization had settled into him fully now, not as resistance, but as something closer to acceptance. And Darius spoke again, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. Initiate a full compliance audit across all flagged entries, he said, and Claire nodded immediately, her fingers moving across the keyboard as she followed the instruction, opening additional panels, activating processes that had likely never been used at this level in this space. And the system responded again, lines of confirmation appearing one after another, and Luis watched closely, his voice steady. Audit initiated, he said, and the words carried weight, because they marked the beginning of something irreversible, not just a correction of the present, but a review of everything that had led to it. And the woman filming stepped slightly to the side, adjusting her angle, capturing not just Darius but the entire scene, the staff, the screen, the shift that had taken place in less than an hour but would carry consequences far beyond it. And she spoke softly, almost as if narrating to herself. This is what accountability looks like. And no one corrected her, because the moment itself confirmed it, and the man near the entrance moved closer as well, not intruding, just present, his voice low but clear. It should have been like this from the start. And Darius heard him, not directly responding, but acknowledging the sentiment with a slight nod, because statements like that were not new. They were echoes of something that had existed long before this moment, long before this building, long before this system had been allowed to operate the way it had. And Evan finally spoke again, but his voice had changed completely now, no longer defensive, no longer attempting to shape the narrative, just direct. What happens to me? He asked, and the question did not carry entitlement. It carried understanding, the kind that comes when someone recognizes that their role in a situation has been fully revealed. And Darius turned his attention back to him, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, and when he answered, his voice remained calm, but it carried finality. Your access is revoked, he said, and Claire did not wait for further instruction, her fingers already moving, executing the command, and within seconds the system confirmed it, authorization removed, credentials invalid, and Luis watched the screen, his voice low but clear. Access terminated, he said, and the words settled into the room like a marker, the point where something ended and something else began. And Evan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, not collapsing, not breaking, just releasing the tension that had been held in place since the moment began. And he did not argue, did not protest, because there was nothing left to argue against. The system had already spoken, and Darius did not linger on him, did not press further, because this was not about prolonging the moment, it was about correcting it. And he turned slightly, addressing the room again, his voice steady, clear. "Every flagged entry will be reviewed," he said. "Every unresolved complaint will be reopened." And Claire nodded as she continued working, her actions aligning with his words in real time. And Louise remained beside her, ready, present, part of the process now instead of just a witness to it. And the woman filming lowered her phone slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to respect. Because what she was seeing was not just a confrontation, it was a transformation, and the security guard, still standing at the edge of the room, relaxed his posture completely, no longer waiting for instruction, because there was nothing left for him to enforce. The situation had moved beyond that, and the lobby itself felt different now, not just quieter, but clearer, like something that had been clouded was now visible in a way it had never been before. And Darius took a final look around the space, his gaze steady, not searching, not questioning, just confirming. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone that was not just authoritative, but resolute. "This place does not decide who belongs," he said. "It reflects it." And the sentence settled into the room like a foundation being reset, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. And no one responded immediately, because there was nothing left to add. The truth had already been spoken, not just in words, but in actions, in systems, in decisions that had been made and corrected in real time. And Evan stood quietly where he was, no longer at the center, no longer defining anything, just present in the outcome of what had been revealed. And Claire and Louise continued working, their roles now aligned with something larger than routine, and the guests remained, not out of curiosity anymore, but because they understood that what they had witnessed was not just a moment. It was a shift, something that would carry forward, something that would not be undone. And the lobby held that understanding in a way that could not be ignored, because once something like this is seen clearly, it does not disappear, it becomes part of the structure itself, part of what defines it moving forward. The lobby did not return to its original state after that. It could not, because something deeper than policy had been corrected, something structural, something that had been quietly shaping every interaction without ever being named. And now that it had been named, exposed, and dismantled in real time, the space itself carried a different kind of presence, not just quieter, but clearer. And Darius stood there for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because he understood that endings matter just as much as revelations, and the way a moment closes defines how it will be remembered. And Claire continued working through the system, her movements no longer reactive but intentional, methodical, as she followed through on each instruction, ensuring that every flagged entry, every override, every unresolved complaint was no longer hidden behind silence, but brought into full visibility. And Luis remained beside her, not as support, but as part of the process now, his posture steady, his role redefined by the clarity of what had just unfolded. And the woman filming slowly lowered her phone, not because the moment had lost significance, but because it had reached a point where recording it no longer felt necessary. It had already imprinted itself into everyone present, and she exhaled softly, her voice quiet but certain. This should not have taken this long. And the statement did not carry blame, it carried truth, and truth in that room no longer needed emphasis. And the man near the entrance nodded in agreement, his gaze steady. "It should not," he said. And the exchange settled into the space like an acknowledgement of something that extended beyond this building, beyond this moment, something that had existed for far too long without interruption. And Darius turned slightly, his attention moving from the system back to the people in the room, because this was never just about code or access levels. It was about behavior, about decisions, about the quiet ways people are treated when no one is watching. And now everyone had been watching, and that changed everything. And he spoke again, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a tone that was not just authoritative, but resolute. "This place will be reviewed from the ground up," he said. And Claire nodded immediately, her hands continuing to move as she executed the next steps. And Louise added quietly, "Audit logs are expanding across all departments." And the confirmation reinforced what had already been set into motion, that this was not a temporary correction. It was a full reset. And Evan remained where he was, no longer at the desk, no longer part of the system in any active way, his presence now defined by what had already been decided. and he looked at Darius one last time, not with resistance, not with confusion, but with something closer to understanding, because the moment had stripped everything else away, leaving only what was real. And he nodded once, small but clear, and then stepped back fully, not out of instruction, but out of recognition that his role in this space had ended, and Darius did not follow him with his eyes, did not extend the moment further than it needed to be extended, because this was not about individuals anymore. It was about what came next, and he turned his attention back to Claire and Luis, his voice steady. "Reassign front desk authority to interim oversight," he said. And Claire responded immediately, "Done," her voice confident, her actions aligned with a system that was now functioning the way it was originally intended to. And Luis glanced at the screen, then back at Darius, his voice firm. "All active processes are now under compliance supervision." And the words carried weight, because they marked the transition from exposure to enforcement, from revelation to structure, and the security guard at the edge of the room finally relaxed completely, stepping further back. No longer part of the moment, in any active sense, just another witness to something that had reshaped the space he worked in, and the guests remained for a moment longer, not because they were unsure what to do, but because they understood they had just seen something that does not happen often, something that does not always get corrected in real time. And the woman who had been filming looked around once more, then spoke quietly. "It is different now." And no one disagreed, because it was not just in the way things looked, but in the way they felt, in the way the air carried something clearer, something grounded, something that did not rely on assumption or appearance. And Darius took one final step back from the desk, not retreating, but creating space, allowing the system, the people, the structure to move forward without needing his constant presence, because real authority does not need to remain visible to be effective. It sets things in motion and then lets them function. And he looked once more at the lobby, at the light reflecting across the marble floors, at the people who had been part of this moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be repeated. "It should have always been this way," he said, and the sentence settled into the room like a closing line, not dramatic, not forced, just true. And Claire paused briefly before continuing her work, her expression focused. Luis stood beside her, steady and present. The guests began to move again, slowly, naturally, as if the space had reset itself around them. And the lobby, once defined by quiet bias and unchecked patterns, now held something entirely different, something clear, something accountable, something that would not easily return to what it had been before, because once a system is seen clearly, it cannot go back to operating in the dark, and that clarity had now become part of its foundation. 3 months later, the lobby no longer felt like a place where silence could hide anything. The same marble floors still reflected the morning light. The same glass doors still turned with quiet precision, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured in square feet or design upgrades. It was something deeper, something structural, something that had been rebuilt from the inside out. And Darius Vaughn walked through those same doors again without announcement, without entourage, dressed the same way he had been the first time. Simple, unassuming, deliberate, and this time no one looked at him with uncertainty. No one paused to question his presence, because the system no longer depended on appearances to decide who belonged. It operated on something far more stable, something far more consistent, and behind the front desk Claire stood with a posture that reflected more than training. It reflected understanding, her movements confident but not rushed, her tone steady with every guest she greeted. And beside her Luis worked with the same quiet focus, the two of them no longer navigating uncertainty, but maintaining a standard that had been clearly defined and actively reinforced. And when Darius approached the desk, they did not react with surprise. They acknowledged him with professionalism, not because of who he was, but because that was now the standard for everyone. And Claire offered a small nod. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and grounded, and Darius returned it just as simply, because this was never about recognition. It was about consistency, and across the lobby guests moved freely, their interactions with staff smooth, unguarded, without that subtle hesitation that had once lingered in the air. And near the entrance a framed plaque had been installed, simple, understated, placed at eye level where no one could miss it, but no one could accuse it of being performative, and it read, "Every guest belongs." No exceptions, and the words did not feel like a slogan. They felt like a standard that had been tested and rebuilt, and the changes extended beyond what could be seen. The audit had reached every department, every process, every layer of decision-making. Unresolved complaints had been reopened, patterns had been traced back to their source, and those sources had been addressed, not quietly, not internally, but with clarity and documentation, and new systems had been implemented, not just to monitor behavior, but to prevent the kind of selective judgment that had once been embedded into routine, and training had been restructured, not as a formality, but as a requirement tied to accountability. Every employee, from front desk to management, now operating under guidelines that left no room for interpretation when it came to respect. And Darius had not needed to stand in that lobby every day for those changes to take hold, because real authority does not rely on presence, it relies on structure, and that structure had been rebuilt to function without exception, and the ripple extended beyond this location, because what had been uncovered here had not been isolated, it had been systemic, and that system had been reviewed across every property under the same ownership, each one undergoing the same level of scrutiny, the same level of correction, and as reports came in over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. What had happened in this lobby had been repeated elsewhere, quieter, less visible, but present, and each instance was addressed with the same clarity, the same refusal to allow silence to cover what needed to be seen. And back in the lobby, Claire handed a guest their room key with a smile that was not forced, not rehearsed, just natural, because the environment around her no longer required her to question who deserved it. And Luis assisted another guest with directions, his tone respectful, consistent, and across the space the flow of movement felt different, not just efficient, but equitable, and Darius observed it all without interruption, without comment, because what mattered was not what he said in that moment, but what had been built from the one before. And as he turned slightly, preparing to move further into the hotel, the woman who had once filmed the original moment stepped through the doors again, her presence unplanned, her timing coincidental but meaningful, and she recognized him immediately, not because of how he looked, but because of what she had witnessed, and she paused for a second before speaking, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty it had held before. "It is different," she said, and Darius met her gaze briefly, nodding once, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, because the difference did not need to be explained, it could be felt, and she glanced around the lobby, taking in the changes, the ease, the absence of tension, and then she added, "This should not have been rare," and Darius responded without hesitation, his voice calm, steady, and grounded in something far deeper than the moment itself. "It is not rare anymore," he said, and the sentence did not sound like a claim. It sounded like a standard that had already been set into place. And as he continued walking through the lobby, the space behind him did not revert, did not shift back into what it had been. It held its structure, its clarity, its purpose, because what had changed was not just the outcome of one moment, but the foundation of how every moment moving forward would be handled. And in that space, under that light, with every interaction that followed, the truth remained visible, not as a reaction, not as a correction, but as the standard itself. And that was the difference. Not who stood at the desk, not who walked through the doors, but the fact that no one needed to prove they belonged before being treated like they did.